Talk about closure. And this is part two of our lecture on functions. And this is actually something that we've already talked about very briefly, like maybe 10 minutes ago. When we talk about this idea of kind of having a global variable, having a function that modifies a global variable because it has access to it, and then us return the global variable. Closure is something that we think about in terms of kind of it's an extension of scope. If you don't understand scope, closure is going to be almost impossible to kind of really internalize. Um, so we'll probably do a quick recap of scope then in the very beginning here. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how we can pass functions now as callbacks into other functions to use. One thing we haven't really talked about yet is, well, how do we return functions, right? How do we return functions to other functions? Because remember, we said that higher order functions are functions that either take in a function to use or return a function, presumably for someone else to use. And so here we have something that's we define a string called, or sorry, we define a function called returns a string. We execute it and returns a string, right? Nothing fancy, very standard JavaScript here based on what we've seen. However, what if that wasn't a sorry. Yeah, sorry. For the slides that I'm skipping over, you can also look through them at your own time. They're just kind of textual versions of what I'm saying, so we probably don't need to spend too much time on it. I promise you, I'm not skipping over anything vitally important. Here we have something called, on line 1, we define a function called greetMe, right? And it's a function. It logs out something very silly, but right now, like, it is a function. On line 5, we have a function called getGreeter, and on line 6, or rather in the body of the function, what we're doing is we're returning greetMe, right? Notice how when we return greetMe on line 6, there is no open and close parentheses after greetMe, which means we're not returning the function after we invoke it. We're literally saying, here's a function, I don't know what it does, I don't even know what it is, here you go. If you want to invoke it at your own discretion, do it like later, do it. But for now, I'm giving you greetMe purely as if it was any other variable. It could be a number or a string or a boolean or anything else. Okay. But once we reach line 8, it's very clear, right, that like we've defined a function called greetMe that we never run. We define a function called getGreeter that returns a function, but that getGreeter function is also never run, right, up until line 8. Line 9 is the first time we actually run any functions on this page. And what we do is we're creating a variable called greeter, and we're setting it equal to the invocation of getGreeter, right? What happens when we invoke getGreeter? Well, it returns the greetMe function, right? But this, like, once again, super key, right? It's returning the greetMe function as if it was any other variable, right? Up until line 9, remember, we never invoke greetMe, right? We're just passing it back and forth between these functions, like it could be a number, right? It could be a boolean. We don't even know yet, right? It's just clear right now that like right now we're passing the greetMe function back and forth, but we're never invoking it. On line 11, we console log out what type of greeter is. On line 12, we look at greeter. On line 13 is the first time that we actually invoke greeter, right? Greeter after line 9 becomes greetMe. So on line 13, when we invoke greeter, it's the same as us invoking greetMe. And so when we look at it, this is what we get. Once again, on line 11, we're saying the type of greeter is a function. On line 12, we're saying it's a function. It's called greetMe. Ignore, like on the second printout there, ignore the bracket notation. That doesn't mean it's an array or anything close to an array. It's just how JavaScript prints out a description of a function, right? So nothing, don't draw any parallels between that and an array. And then finally, on line 13, we actually invoke greeter, which is greetMe, and when we invoke that, we console log out hi, right? So the point here is that on line 9, where we're invoking the getGreeter function, which gives us a function that we never call until line 13, right? This is very common normally. Like we've seen this already, right? Like normally, like in your workshops, you write a function, you write a bunch of things, and the tests don't invoke it until it does a bunch of other things, right? This is the same idea. It's like we're saying, hey, here's a number, or here's a boolean, or in this case, here's a function. Hold on to it for now, and then use it later on whenever you want to actually use it. So I know it sounds like I'm really belaboring the point here, right? But the point here is that we are able to return a function as if it was any other variable, and we could opt not to use it until much later. Okay. However, if we look at this code now on line, so everything up until line 6 is the same, right? But now on line 6, look what we're doing. We're actually invoking greet_me, right? So we're saying, hey, invoke greet_me and give me whatever greet_me returns. So let's talk through this. On line 9, we're saying let greeter equals get greeter. So when we invoke get greeter, it says, oh, by the way, like here, let me give you back the invocation of greet_me. And what does greet_me return? Sorry, what? Hi. Hi. Oh, hi. Anything else?
Are you referring to line 2?
I'm referring to like as I carry through line 9.
Oh,
What does greeter equal? Is I guess the base of the question.
The invocation of greeter. Are we on slide 6?
What's the question again?
After I run line 9, what does greeter equal?
Invocation of greeter.
What is the value of greeter? If I was to console log it out.
Function greet_me.
Function greet_me, okay. Hi, that was another guess. Anyone else?
Undefined.
Undefined. Another guess. Yeah. Right. I mean, the answer here is undefined, and you said you saw it like on the slide, right? Yeah. Like.
But it's not. It's because it's complex, right? You can't break it down to.
No, not quite. Like, what is sorry?
Then I don't understand that. So.
Okay, this function greet_me, right? Where does hi fit in? Hi is a console log. Console logs mean nothing. They have zero bearing on the function and what it returns, right? Console log just says, hey, human, take a look at this. It has no bearing on the actual return of the function, right? So it can't be hi, right? The second guess I think was like it returns a function greet_me, right? But look, this is not returning greet_me. This is returning whatever greet_me gives back after I run it, right? And so therefore, in the previous example, remember how we were able to return greet_me by not invoking and saying, here's greet_me, I think it's a function, but to me it's just a variable, whatever, right? Here you go. That's perfectly fine. In this case, we're not saying return this, right? Like if we were to evaluate this part of the code here, this part, greet_me invoke is going to give me back return to me whatever greet_me returns. Well, greet_me doesn't have a return statement. So once again, right, in JavaScript, any function that does not have a return statement is by default going to return undefined. And because of that, line 6 becomes return undefined. And so then get greeter invoke becomes return undefined. So this becomes undefined. And then lastly, greeter becomes undefined, right? So it's a very logical process of us tracing through the code trying to figure out, okay, at which point, like at which point are we doing what, or rather what's being passed back and forth. And so now when we run it, you'll notice how the hi is still run, right? The hi is still prints out. And the reason why it prints out is because, look, here, we are very, very happily invoking the greet_me function, right? But notice how before it was being invoked down here, so hi printed out last. Not anymore. Now we're printing out first because on line 9, when we run get greeter runs greet_me, so we automatically print out hi right away, right? After console logs out hi, the function says, okay, I'm done. Oh, did you want me to give you something to return? Well, here's undefined because I don't have any other instructions, right? And so therefore, greeter becomes undefined. And then on line 11, when we console log out, type of greeter is undefined. Greeter's type is itself because it's like its own data type, but undefined is its own data type. So that's why type of undefined is undefined. We print out what it actually is, which is undefined. And then lastly, on line 13 there, when we try invoking it, I'm not sure if you can see that really clearly, but it says type error. Greeter is not a function, right? We're trying to invoke something that cannot be invoked, and so we get the JavaScript error there. Okay? So when you work on today's, like, this workshop's probably going to be very, very frustrating for you guys. Like, it's because like this is the kind of trace back we need to do, right? Like at every instance, you can't just assume that like, oh, like hopefully this gives you back a number, like let's go for it, right? Like you need to be very, very clear on tracing through every single step and trying to figure out, okay, what does this function give me? Okay, this function depends on this function. Am I looking at a function as a function or as what it returns to me, right? And you need to be very, very kind of clear-headed as you traverse through these things. Okay. Finally, this is something that's also very doable. It doesn't. It's literally the same thing as we did before, except now rather than defining the greet_me function outside of getGreeter, we now return it in. We define it inside getGreeter and we return it right away, right? So on line 10 there, when we say when we invoke getGreeter, what happens is line 3 through 5, like the function is created, nothing happens, except we create a variable called greet_me, and then on line 7 we actually return that function greet_me, right? So on line 10 there, greeter becomes the greet_me function. Notice how we never invoke greet_me, so we're treating greet_me still as a variable that points to a function, and then so therefore greeter becomes greet_me, and when we invoke greeter, we're basically invoking greet_me, which console logs out hi over there. Okay. Yeah. No. Yeah. Claire.
So would it be fair to say that if you invoke a function, it must have a return inside that function, otherwise it's going to give you errors as like a minimum?
If you're returning whatever a function,
like in order for it to continue like through.
If you're returning, so one, like for us, undefined is bad, but there are cases in which undefined is like it's usable, right? So the answer is not always, but like a function only needs a return value if the person or the function who's calling it is expecting it to give something back, right? So in our previous example, greet_me should return something, right? Because why? Because getGreeter is expecting to return whatever greet_me gives back. And when we didn't have anything to give back, we gave back something that getGreeter still passed on, right? Oh, actually, my analogy holds up here, right? If you're doing things for your boss, right? Like if your boss's boss asks him or her for a report, right, and they ask you to do it, you could give them you could give them a folder and say, here's a report, and they could pass it to their boss. But if the report is empty or the folder is empty, right? Like it's like your boss, assuming they're paying attention, like they'll still pass it onwards, right? It just might not be what you want it to be, right? So returns only matter if you're expecting something that you also want to be using or returning, right? The counterpoint is actually the example earlier from our for each loop, right? Whereas for that function, like we didn't need to return anything because we weren't expecting it to like we were not using it so it returns something to us. We were using it to modify a global variable, right? So the return is critical for us only when we expect to use the return value. Like so, there are use cases for having functions that don't return anything, and that's the expected behavior.
Yeah. Do something, you give a result back.
Right, or at least the result is captured in some other way, right? Like sending emails to a bunch of people, right? It's like I don't need to see a returner that you sent it, is you sent it, right? That's like the gating factor here. Okay, so as you're going through the workshop today, just at every instance, just even like don't try to assume something's gonna work. Like at every instance, be very clear with you and your partner on like exactly what's being returned at every single step, and like whether or not something's a variable, whether or not something's a string or a function. And kind of how it's used, how it's going to be used downstream.
So for this one, it's going to console log hi, right?
Yep.
But is it also returning undefined?
It is. It is. We just don't see it here because we never print it out. But you're absolutely right. This is returning undefined too. Oh, sorry. Or rather, sorry. This is returning undefined. This is doing the normal thing of returning back a function. This is going to console log out hi. That's going to return undefined. But I guess, Claire, to your point, right, like, we don't really care, right? We run this function. We're not expecting to use whatever this returns anywhere, so we just ignore it. But it's still returning undefined, but the main point here is to show that a console logs out hi, right? So that's a function in which, like, the important thing is what a console logs out, not what it returns. Okay, this slide, one-liner, we can also return anonymous functions, too. Not much to write home about here. Okay. And then these next two slides are also very like extensions of the fact that like, well, if we're returning a function, it clearly is going to have the full functionalities of a function, right? So it's going to be able to take in parameters, and so here, get greeter is going to return this function. So greeter becomes that function. Well, if we invoke that function and that function expects a name as a parameter or as an argument, yeah, let's pass in a string as a name, and we'll print it out, and it will be able to do all of that. Notice how in the last example, right? Remember how we talked about how parameters, like if a function is expecting like 3 arguments and you only give it 1, the function will still run. It will just assume that the last 2 arguments are both undefined, right? Like that's its own like safeguard. So here on line 12 there, when we invoke greeter says, well, you got to give me something as like the first argument. And if we say, yeah, I got nothing for you, it'll say, okay, great. I'm going to assume that let name, that parameter that you said I should have, let name equals undefined, and that's what I'm going to print out for you. Okay. Cool. All right. Closure. Yeah. I mean, the idea of closure once again, right? Or sorry, the idea of scope once again is the idea that like assuming we're looking at kind of functional scopes right now. The idea is if I create a variable in this scope, any other scopes created within me can receive it, but really like the availability of a particular variable is like my scope, my parent scope, my parent's parent scope, all the way up until I get to the global scope, right? I can't see inside my sibling scopes, and I can't see inside my children's scopes. My children have access to my scopes, but not vice versa, right? And so here the idea is we created in this greeter scope there on between lines 6 through 12, we've created a bunch of variables, right? We've created name, we've created says hi, but we can only use them inside the greeter variable. Once we leave the greeter, we create it inside the greeter scope. Once we leave the greeter scope, we can't use it anymore. In this particular example, the highlighted portion is like, hey, in line 7, we create this variable called name. On line 8, we create a variable called says hi. On line 11, when we actually run says hi is going to say hi name, right? Well, on line 9 there, the first time it runs, it's going to say, okay, do I have a variable in my own scope between lines 8 through 10 called name? And the answer is no. Okay, do my parents have a variable called name? Who are my parents? My parents is this scope made under the function greeter. Is there a name variable inside greeter? There is. Great, so I'm going to use that, right? There could be another variable called name in the global scope. I don't really care. I found a match, right? And I found the closest match, so that's what I'll use. And so when we invoke greeter, we get back hi Marie because it's reading the variable Marie from the greeter scope. Does this make sense, everyone? Still,
Yeah.
Like recap wise, this is still a refresher. Okay, great. So then let's move on to closure. Closure is the idea that when we create a scope, or rather when we create a function, that function not only has access to that scope at that moment, it actually memorizes. It like keeps a copy of that scope for reference later on. And so let's take a look at how this looks, right? So here we're creating a function called getGreeter, right? And we're console logging out a few things to let us know where in the code we are, right? So the first thing we do is on line 2 that we console log out, all right, getGreeter is running. On line 4, we create a variable called name equals Marie, right? On line 6, we say getGreeter is finished running, and on line 8, we actually return a function that console logs out hi name. Okay. On line 13, we do our normal thing of saying, hey, like greeter equals getGreeter. What does getGreeter return? GetGreeter returns an anonymous function. So greeter is now equal to whatever function is we created on line 8 through 10. But when we console log out greeter, we get hi Marie, right? And so like maybe it's, I guess it'll take some time to kind of appreciate like how cool this is. But like right now, like we're invoking this function all the way outside of the getGreeter scope, right? Like we're invoking this on line 14. The getGreeter scope goes from line 1 to line 11, right? we're running greater on line 14, but we're able to access a variable that was created inside the getGreeter scope, even though we're not inside the getGreeter scope, right? And so this is what this is like the crux of this idea of closure, which is when this function was created, it not only says I now have access to these variables, it says I'm actually going to keep track. I'm going to permanently memorize these variables so that I will always have access to them. Right? So even when this function is being passed outside of this function, is being passed somewhere else into another scope, it will still retain, in this case, memory of this main variable called Marie. Right? So now, no matter where we use this function, it will always have access to this variable called Marie.
That still respects scope because it only works because it's inside. It's on the same scope as
Right.
the definition, right?
Right. It works because when it was, remember, closure, or sorry, scope is defined at the point of creation, right?
Okay.
When we created this function, it had access to this variable. Now we're just saying is, hey, once you have access to this variable, you're going to permanently have access to this variable. You won't lose it if someone passes you off into another scope and try to use it somewhere else, right? And so the reason why something like this is incredibly powerful and like obviously like it in some ways it really is very fundamental to a lot of JavaScript is like is now on line 14 there I'm invoking this greeter function, right? And I have access to this variable, but guess what? I can't change it, right? It's almost like I've permanently given someone like a read-only access, a read-only version copy of this variable, right? Because once I leave this getGreeter scope, I can't change the name variable anymore, but I do remember what it was. And so if you think about like the applications here for like security stuff, right? Or like, hey, like I want this function to run. I want it to memorize, this particular person's user ID, but I don't want anyone to be able to change it. This is the way to do it. But yeah. So coming back, just like really like just notice how like now we are able to access a variable in a scope that we normally organically would not have access to, right? And that's because of closure. Once again, the idea of closure is that when a function is created, it not only has access to the variables it has access to at that point, it creates a copy of the variables it has access to at that point. So no matter where we use it, like here on line 14, when we use the greeter function, you can almost think of this greeter kind of like temporarily coming inside here, doing its thing, and operating as if it was here instead of here. This slide is, oh yeah, I mean this slide is it's almost identical in some ways, right? Like getGreeter, we're returning a function here, except now we're saying hi name. Oh, name happens to be a parameter. That's totally fine, right? Parameters are just variables too. So therefore, no matter where we use this greeter function, we will always have access to this particular main variable. Okay. And then here the question is, well, what if both functions take parameters? Well, it doesn't matter, right? Like if I here I return a function, I use name two. Name two also happens to use name one. Well, like yeah, like here if I use this greeter function, I pass in Rosalind. What it does is Rosalind is something that was given to me explicitly, right? But I still have access to this name one variable from because of closure. And so basically, like imagine if you see this, imagine if we're running greeter as it was running like between lines 5 and 6, right? Like it will have access to every single variable that would be available to it if it was running between lines 5 and 6 instead of line 9. Like pretend like it's basically in the getGreeter scope. Oh shoot! Sorry, this is okay. Cool. And then this slide is we're not showing any new concepts here. It's just to show you kind of why this is powerful. The idea is now like we've kind of created this actually not a new concept but a new use case perhaps. Notice how on line 7 we use getGreeter, right, and we feed in Marie. On line 8 we use getGreeter and we feed in Rosalind, right? Here, what are we doing? we're invoking getGreeter twice. Each time, getGreeter is going to return a brand new function, right? So basically, introduce Marie to and introduce Rosalind to, even though these two functions do the same thing, they both have a different memory of what name1 is, right? Because when we created getGreeter here on line 7, in this case, getGreeter, Marie, name1 is Marie, right? So when we return a function that becomes introduce Marie to, this function is going to permanently think of name1 as Marie. On line 8 now, we invoke getGreeter with Rosalind. Introduce Rosalind to is going to be a function that permanently thinks that name1 is always going to be Rosalind, right? So here we have kind of one function, but now we're able to create different variations of it, right? Like, it's almost like we're imprinting each function with a different mother or different name or different, or different set of variables. And so now that we have that, notice how line 10 through 11 and then 13 through 14, we're saying introduce Marie to, introduce Rosalind to. We're now able to create, some pretty extensible functions here, right? Introduce Marie to is always going to memorize that, hey, the first, like your mother, so to speak, or rather your name1 is Marie, right? And so now, like if I was to write this function without negative closure, it'd be that, I would need to take in 2 arguments, right? The first one's hi blank, second one's hi, my name is blank, right? But now we've kind of memorized that Marie is the first name here, so we only need to pass in the second argument. So it saves us the trouble of having to pass in an extra argument that now we've basically just permanently imprinted and saying, hey, this function is only useful for introducing people to Marie and Rosalind, vice versa. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. That was it. There's a bunch of other functions that I want to talk about with array methods, but I do want to make sure you have enough time to work on the workshops first. So let's work on the workshop for the next 2 hours, maybe hour and a half or so, and then I'll do a quick kind of presentation, maybe 5 to 10 minutes probably, on the array mapper reduce filters that we also use with arrays. They're like for each, except they're a lot better at capturing the output from those functions. But for the workshop for today, you only need to be working on return statements and closure. Okay. Any questions? Cool.